Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Allen. We are mere months away from the scheduled Ontario provincial election of June 2nd, 2022. And by now, you should have already seen the telltale signs of an election on the horizon. Political ads coming out, governments announcing lots of treats for various voting groups, and less controversial legislation being passed. You should also keep your eyes peeled for any indication of an early election call. Yes, the provincial Conservative government, led by Doug Ford, could call the election at any time. This isn't America where fixed election dates are set in stone, but Ontario does have a sort of target election date every 4 years. So what is happening in Ontario? Well, the government recently introduced a minimum wage increase. We have a continued promise to cut some of the provincial gas excise tax. We have seen an increase in the deficit through the fall economic update and a hope to even lift all COVID restrictions by March. Yeah, I ain't holding my breath on that last one. This isn't my first rodeo, and hasn't the provincial government slogan of promise made, promise kept been more of a promise made, promise flip-flopped? Time will tell. And again, perhaps not that much time if we go to an early election. And what would that result look like if we had that election? Well, joining me now to shed some light on the political and fiscal issues at the Ontario Legislature is Jay Goldberg, Interim Ontario Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and David Clement, North American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Centre. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to diving right into this discussion of all things politics and money and all sorts of things in Ontario. So why don't we start with maybe you, Jay? Could you give us an indication of what is the fiscal health of Ontario as it stands right now?
Well, the fiscal health of Ontario as it stands right now is not very good. As you mentioned in the fall economic update, the finance minister surprised us. We're seeing a higher deficit. It's $21.5 billion, and that's over $5 billion higher than last year. And of course, that was the year of lockdowns and shutdowns in the beginning of COVID and all those extra spending programs. So our deficit is actually up. Our spending is way up. Spending is up in every sector, not just healthcare, but everywhere. Education, justice, children's services. Literally every sector spending is up, and we haven't seen any of the tax cuts that the government's promised us actually implemented. You mentioned the gas tax cut. We have a promise to keep a promise, but we haven't actually seen the follow through yet. Mm-hmm. So we've got high deficits, high spending, and not much on the tax side to be happy about.
And just so that I understand, is obviously there's a lot of discussion now about inflation, that we see inflation going up. Has this deficit kept up with the rate of inflation? Is it higher? Is it lower?
The deficit is higher than the rate of inflation. We're going up $5 billion compared to last year. So the progressive conservatives are really getting ready to spend in advance of the next election.
Okay, David, there are some grim numbers that Jay just shared with us. I assume you read and you watched the fall economic update. Was there anything that surprised you there? Are you concerned with some of these numbers?
I am concerned because we started, if we go back to the Wynne government, we're looking at the most indebted sub-sovereign unit in the world. And so that's the starting point. And so, yes, COVID is extraordinary circumstances. But at the end of the day, the chickens do come home to roost. And they are going to be left with, let's say they win another majority government, they are going to be left with some serious budget constraints. And so I think it would be far better suited from a financial position for them to start to explain to Ontarian taxpayers what their strategy is, rather than playing this game of hide the ball, where maybe if they win again, we'll see fiscal conservatism win the day, and in their second mandate, they'll get their house in order. It's a worrying sign because this can only go on for so long. And also couple this with what you mentioned in regards to inflation. If we're going to be raising taxes to cover deficits, that may be a necessary step. I don't like it. But if you're also going to do that alongside decade high or 2-decade high inflation, people are going to be getting punched in the face essentially from two sources, inflation and taxation. And that is just a really worrying possibility if you're a taxpayer in Ontario.
Yes, I think Canadians who lived through the 80s and the 90s are concerned with, what would happen if the interest rates went up to, the way it was in the early 80s. What happens if we enter another massive recession like we did in the early 90s? We got to cut to commercial break, though. I'm going to come right back to you in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're talking about the Ontario political situation. We're heading into an election in just a few months. June 2nd, 2022 is the scheduled date. Could happen earlier. We had a fall economic update. Things don't look so great. We don't seem so fiscally healthy, and it's not just because of COVID. That's what we're hearing. Well, joining me again is Jay Goldberg with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and David Clement with the Consumer Choice Centre. David, before we went to commercial, I painted some potential fears that Ontarians have. We have experienced in a few generations ago high interest rates. We've experienced recession. What happens with all this debt and spending to the deficit? What happens with this debt that we carry in Ontario, the largest sub-sovereign of any place? What happens if the interest rates go up?
I mean, that's a very good question, and it really comes down. There are two big problems with this, and the first is what happens to the status of government debt. So, how much of the province's debt is at risk if interest rates go up a quarter, half, or a full percent? That obviously drastically inflates the size of Ontario's total debt. And then there's a consumer and private debt side of this. Folks who may be a little over leveraged on their homes. What happens if interest rates go up on them? We're in the middle of what I think is a unprecedented housing price inflation. What happens to those folks when interest rates go up? Folks have maybe just bought a house. And so it really is not to sound like too much of a doomsday predictor, but it is quite scary, because if rates were to go up 1%, that might not sound like a lot to viewers and listeners, but that would have a drastic impact on both sides of that debt equation.
So, Jay, I want you to chime in here. What happens to the debt if we can't pay for it? What happens if the interest goes up? I mean, do we just keep borrowing and borrowing till what end?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what the situation will be. Our deficit this year is set to be $21.5 billion. That's the largest in the history of the province. And so it's extremely concerning. And actually, right now, we're spending more than $1 billion a month on debt interest. So we're already spending a ton of money. That's more than we spend on post-secondary education. And if interest rates go up, we'll be looking at much more than $1 billion a month. And so you think of all the services we can't invest in, more investments in healthcare, education, perhaps implementing some of the tax cuts that the Ford Conservatives promised last time. And instead, we're spending over $1 billion a month just on debt interest. And that's not paying down the debt, that's just paying interest, the bondholders. So that's really getting us nowhere. Right. And we're wasting a lot of money on that. That's only going to get worse in the years ahead if interest rates go up.
Well, and it probably will also turn off investors. I mean, even bondholders, how many people would want to invest in Ontario knowing we have such a huge, massive debt and we can't seem to get our house in order?
And how many people will still want to work in Ontario? So if COVID has shown anything, I mean, I'm doing this show from a different continent at this moment. So how many folks in COVID have realized that their form of employment is maybe a lot more flexible than they first thought in terms of where they live? And obviously, we live in a country where people can move to different provinces. We live in a very interconnected global world, and COVID has put a dent in that, but I'm sure it will return. So what happens if folks move and taxpayers leave and decide, I'm going to pay my provincial income tax in Alberta, or I'm going to pay it, or I'm not going to pay it at all. I'm going to live in the United States, or I'm going to live elsewhere. And I think we could be in for a pretty rude awakening, given now that so many people are attuned to the fact that they can do their jobs from almost anywhere.
Right. That's a very good point. What happens when we become a have-not province? What happens?
And I was going to say that's exactly why Premier Doug Ford needs to implement some of those tax cuts he promised Ontarians last time to make Ontario a very attractive place to be, particularly as we're fighting high levels of debt, high deficits, and the interest rates we're talking about.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I mean, there's a whole banquet of taxes, I suppose, we can go through, and cuts that he alleged to or he promised. Jay, you wrote something very interesting, and we've got to cut to commercial, so I'll just kind of tease our audience with this. You wrote, when Ford declared the party is over with the taxpayers' money, it seems that he only meant the Liberal Party with the taxpayers' money was over, and that Ford has decided to throw a party of his own and is even more expensive than the one he ended. I thought you said it very well. In 20 seconds, what did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that spending is way up under Premier Ford. It went up $5 billion over what Kathleen Wynne was spending, and that was before we had the pandemic.
Right.
Of course, we've seen the pandemic now, and we can certainly talk more about that on the other side.
Okay, we'll be right back after this commercial. We're discussing Ontario's fiscal health and what we can anticipate as we head into election season. We have a scheduled election for June 2nd, 2022, which could happen any time because you can call the election earlier. It doesn't have to happen on June 2nd, but that's when it's scheduled to happen. Joining me again is Jay Goldberg from Ontario, from the Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and David Clement, American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Centre. Before we went to break, Jay, I threw out some slogans that Ford used during the election. I know, because I was a candidate even for a short period of time in that election. The party with the taxpayers' money is over. I remember this. We all remember it. But you put it well. I don't think the party ever ended. In fact, I think it got worse. Why? Why have things not changed?
Well, the party's still going on, as you said. For example, I think a great example of this is political welfare. Doug Ford promised to stop giving taxpayer money to political parties for them to spend on whatever they want, whether it's attack ads or lawn signs. He's actually increased it. We're going to spend $14 million this year handing money to the PCs and the Liberals, NDP, Green Party, and this is taxpayer dollars.
No, explain this for our viewers, because they may not understand what is political welfare and how does it work? Why are we paying for political ads?
So basically, political parties are given a certain amount of money for every vote they received in the previous election. And that happens 4 times a year. And it costs roughly $13 to $14 million. So that's literally money paid for by taxpayers, handed over to political parties, and there's no limit on what they can spend on it. Doug Ford rightly said he would get rid of it. He should. We shouldn't have to be subsidizing these things. But unfortunately, he's increased it, and he's actually arranged for a $10 million payday loan for Ontario's political parties to get next June, right before the next election, to spend even more of our money trying to win office.
This to me seems like that there are people living high on the hog, that we here are working, we're paying our taxes, we're putting our trust in our political leaders to do the job. And here you're telling me that, these political leaders, because obviously, there's the government that allows these grants to be given, but then there are parties that are accepting it, that these political parties are accepting taxpayers' dollars for partisan political advertising?
Yeah, it really is a cartel system where all the parties want taxpayer money. They all want to be able to spend it on an election. And so you're actually seeing a consensus with all of the parties at Queen's Park, despite the fact that last time Doug Ford promised to get rid of this. It's gone at the federal level, and Ford needs to get rid of it here too.
David, is this shocking to you? I knew this was happening, but I still want to really spell this out for my viewers. It's not right. This doesn't seem right.
No, it certainly isn't right to use taxpayer money to fund political parties. And I know that they have some sort of threshold, so there's a limit to it in regards to how much support you get. But you have to ask your question. The question is, this should be nonpartisan. There is a Communist Party of Ontario, I'm sure, and there are new emerging far-right parties or parties that may be considered anti-vaccine. You ask yourself, do we really want public money going to those types of political parties? Probably not. And that would be a justification for getting rid of them for all of them.
The justification for me is I don't want any of my taxpayer dollars going to any political party, period.
They should be able to raise money based on attracting support, not based on extracting support.
That's exactly
it's just
right.
a huge, huge, huge problem from my perspective.
Excellent line. David, Jay was mentioning that there have been a lot of promises by the Ford government that haven't been delivered on. What are some of the ones that are on your radar, ones that you would like to see? What promises would you like to see happen, or what changes do you think he should be making?
The beer store. I can't believe that this foreign-owned corporate monopoly still controls our alcohol retail market. I mean, convenience stores and other private retailers who would enter the space have been begging and knocking at the door saying, hey, let us enter the market. We know the Ford government wants to do it. They just have to have the political backbone to actually follow through with it. And again, this should be nonpartisan. If you're a conservative, it's a free market or limited government approach. If you're a progressive, how can you justify this niche opportunity for this corporate giant in Ontario? It really should be a no-brainer. This should unite both progressives and conservatives and folks who care about fairness in the middle. And yet it's still something that's lingering in the background. And I mean, my worry is that it becomes maybe a campaign issue this time around. And let's say Ford doesn't win. I have zero faith in the other two alternatives to actually make any serious consumer-friendly reform in regards to alcohol. And so I think he has to be the one who does it.
We have 10 seconds before commercial. You said foreign-owned. Who owns the beer store?
It's owned by a conglomerate, basically the three largest brewers in the world. So they're owned by three large companies who are not Canadian in regards to where they pay taxes and things like that.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on what's happening in Ontario politics, especially when it comes to promises and our fiscal health. Jay Goldberg, what promises have not been met? What promises did Premier Doug Ford make when he campaigned, and which ones has he not met, and which ones would you like to see happen in these few short months before the election?
Well, as you said, the party with taxpayers' money never ended. But on the tax side of things, Premier Ford, he promised to cut the gas tax by 5.7 cents a liter. He now is promising to keep his promise, but we've heard a lot of this, and we want to see it actually happen. We've got the highest gas prices in history. And then, of course, he promised a 20% cut in the second income tax bracket, which could save hardworking taxpayers almost $900 a year. So there's a lot he can do. He seems to be going really far on the spending side of things, trying to attract votes. I think it's time to deliver on tax cuts and give meaningful relief to families.
Now, I remember when we were running in the provincial PC leadership that happened suddenly a few years ago. Kathleen Wynne, then Premier, was in the middle of implementing a multi-tiered minimum wage hike. And I remember we were all promising, okay, we're going to hold off. We're going to take a lay of the land, see how this would impact small businesses before going further to introduce another hike. Well, Doug Ford's government just promised that they were going to follow through with the next tier, which was to bring minimum wage up to $15 an hour in Ontario. David, is this the right move, and is this the right move now?
So I think wanting to support lower income residents of Ontario is appropriate. That's a valid concern. I mean, these are the folks who really bore the brunt of the pandemic. I say this as someone who's worked remote the whole time. And these are the people who showed up to work. These people were there every day. And I mean, I don't use the word hero lightly, but they really kept things going for a long time. Whether they were cashiers or drivers or any profession that falls into that wage bracket, it's certainly going to have business implications. I mean, look at the hospitality industry and it trying to get itself back on its feet. So it's probably not a great time for them. But there is another approach that you can do, and that's just simply increasing the basic personal amount for what Ontario, when Ontario starts applying the income tax. And so just increase that. I mean, I think it should be fairly straightforward to say that low-income people shouldn't pay that much in tax or shouldn't pay tax to a certain point. And so let's drastically increase that, give those people a break on their paychecks, rather than forcing businesses to pay more, which could lead to layoffs, fewer job opportunities, tighter margins for industries that are trying to recover after an unprecedented pandemic. And so that would be the better approach to help folks who really need it, in my mind.
Well, and that's a very good point. Again, when this became an issue 3 years ago, we said, well, minimum wage could be raised, but what is the cost to business? Does that mean that we're going to raise the wage across the board, but then fewer people would have a job because, as you indicated, they might be laid off? Businesses can't support that. And we know small businesses have really been squeezed during the COVID crisis. Jay, is the minimum wage, I'm assuming as the Canadian Taxpayers Federation spokesperson, you're going to say no, but I'll give you a chance nonetheless. Is this the right time for this kind of increase, or should it not happen at all?
Well, obviously, it's a tough time. The increase is not nearly as dramatic as we saw under Kathleen Wynne. She increased the minimum wage by about $3 all at once. And so that was shocking for businesses. But I think there was an excellent point that David made, which is that if you really increase the basic personal amount, and here in Ontario, it's about 10,000. In Alberta, it's much closer to 18,000. So that's a really, really great way to make sure there's more money in the pockets of those who have lower incomes without hurting businesses unduly. So I think in the future, if the government wants to look at ways to help those who are making a lower wage, a great way to do that, raise the basic personal amount. That can help every taxpayer. So that's definitely something that should be looked at.
Okay, so go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, and it's sellable. You just say, hey, folks who are struggling, we're going to get the government off your back.
Exactly.
And that's how you sell it. And you say, hey, this is what we're doing. We're taking way too much money from you folks. And here's the relief that you guys not only need, but deserve, because you guys have been keeping the economy functioning while we've been going through this pandemic.
And I think that resonates with all Canadians, not just Ontarians. You know, cut me some slack with my taxes. Who wants to pay more tax?
Yep.
Absolutely. Thank you both for joining me today. It's been an excellent discussion.
Thank you.
So we'll see what happens in the coming months to see if the party with the taxpayers' money will actually come to an end, or will it just be the Ford government's party with the taxpayers' money coming to an end? Time will tell. But for Counterpoint, this is Tanya Granick-Allen.